Good morning. All right. So, your lecture on dead empires and new states. Now, this is a very short lecture. It's only like 5 or 6 slides because there's a lot of information that I pack into these slides. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go through all of the full sets of details here simply because with the way the situation is, guys, it's easier for you guys to simply just read about it, and you'll get a lot of the stuff in your research assignment for this week anyway. So, let's get into it. Now, the whole topic of this week, I apologize for the background noise. My son is helping me right now. Shh, buddy. Okay, so anyhow, what this week is meant to cover is it's meant to cover the last decades of the Cold War. Really, essentially, it's like the 1970s onward through the early 1990s, as we see a large set of independence movements, the breakup of the last shattered remains of the World War II era British and French empires. We also see towards the 90s the collapse of the USSR and the Soviet bloc and many of the communist countries. So, we're going to see a whole bunch of different paths that are taken. So right off the bat, guys, post-World War II, we see colonial empires collapse. And it's not like it's something that happens instantly. It's not like the defeat of the Germans where there's a specific date where you can say this is the end of the Third Reich. Instead, the colonial empires, again, mostly Britain and France, although the others sort of have empires left, they collapse slowly over the time period of decades. The movements are usually nationalistic, either ethnic or religious. And keep in mind, guys, that religious refers to Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, whatever, whereas ethnic has to do with your tribal background. So we'll get to a map of Africa here where I'm going to once again point out that describing people as African is not particularly accurate. Importantly, some of these are non-violent. We're going to see some examples where the independence is achieved by petitioning the UN, or they literally just vote themselves out of a country. There's a couple examples of that happening. Others, unfortunately, quite a few are going to be violent, where we're going to see civil wars erupt, or we're going to see ethnic tribal warfare occur. We also see the appearance of a new breed of authoritarian warlords. Now, these guys are a little bit different from dictators in the past in that even though their whole deal is based on strength of military might, the area and territories they control more resemble medieval warlords than they do anything from like the 18th or 19th century with the authoritarian powers. That's what happens when you run into Daddy's chair. So, general trends we're going to see, and this is super important for understanding why the world currently is the way it is. This, by the way, is a symbol of the UN, for those of you who didn't do last week's work. Former colonies tend to lack infrastructure or the bureaucracy, that's the government officials, that are required to function smoothly. We see this happening all over the world where because the colonies were deliberately malnourished politically and economically, and this is what kept them reliant on the colonizers. So, for instance, you go to places in Africa where one of the reasons they still struggle to this day is because when they gained their independence, the Brits or the French or the Belgians left, and they took everything with them. All the people who knew how to run the government, they took them with them. They didn't build anything to last except to serve their purposes. They didn't build to make a functional country after they left. So, it's important to understand that especially the American perspective, because, Americans, there's this really unfortunate and vaguely racist tendency to think that many countries in like Southeast Asia and Africa are failed or violent nations or poor nations because of some kind of inherent flaw in how they ran themselves. But it's important to remember that unlike, say, the United States, which had a fully functional bureaucracy put in place based on their colony homeland, in these places, we don't see that. We also see new power struggles form to control resources, especially in former African colonies. Because remember, Africa as a continent is incredibly wealthy in resources, but because those resources have been stripped for so long to fuel less wealthy European, or less, I shouldn't say wealthy, wealthy European nations, that it left a big struggle. And of course, whoever controls the money controls the country. All right, so now we're going to go by sections. And remember, there's more stuff I'd normally talk about. This would, even though it's only 6 slides, this would normally be like a half-hour lecture, but I only got about a little less than 10 more minutes. So, on the Indian subcontinent, we have the colony of India, which, keep in mind, was much larger than it is now in terms of space, is partitioned into several states, mostly on religious lines. There is a sectarian violence period, so as India is being established, we see some violence break out as people try to migrate to the parts of India they want to be in based on their ethnic or religious backgrounds. This is also when Gandhi is assassinated. Now, notably, he's not assassinated by someone from a rival ethnic or religious group. He's actually assassinated by a fellow Hindu. And the reason this guy did is this guy was an ultra-nationalist who believed that India should be a country of Hindu nationals for Hindu nationals, and that's it. All those Muslims and Sikhs and Buddhists, they need to get their own country. Gandhi said, no, we need to be a melting pot of religious tolerance, and he said, nope, pistol to the back of the head. Now, some of those countries that come out. So we get first Pakistan, which was originally called West Pakistan, now it's just Pakistan. So Pakistan is to, as you might imagine, the west of what we think of as India now, and it fought a civil war and then later a straight-up war with India over the Kashmir region. There is still a struggle with Muslim extremists. Pakistan, to this day, has a major problem with Muslim extremism. Now, keep in mind, of course, my apologies for that just like any other country or any other religion, most Muslims are not violent psychopaths in the same way that most Christians aren't violent psychopaths. But turn on the news, and you'll find an example without too much effort because they're the ones who get all the attention for both Muslim and Christians. Bangladesh, which is formerly East Pakistan, used to be the eastern section of the India colony, is one of the poorest nations in the world, mainly for 2 reasons, the first being a long history of government corruption. And this starts all the way back with the East India Trade Company, which deliberately undermined any possibility for decades of a functional local government, and unfortunately, 2 centuries basically of this became a habit. The other thing is Bangladesh is also one of the lowest countries in the world, meaning that it's very much sea level. It's very swampy and marshy, so it's extremely susceptible to natural disasters, which of course are very expensive to clean up. They lead to great loss of life, which damages the economy, so this becomes a cascading effect. Lastly, we have Sri Lanka, which is a small island nation, very wealthy in jewels, like jewels that you can mine from the earth. However, it has 2 ethnic groups, the Sinhalese and the Tamil, that to this day compete for dominance, and it is a violent civil war. Alright, moving on to Southeast Asia. Hey, knock it off. Moving on to Southeast Asia, we see the Philippines, which are actually an example of the United States empire partially collapsing. They gained independence from the U.S. I know it says for U.S. This should say from. I apologize. Immediately after World War II. However, because of, once again, the United States treated them a very specific way, they become almost completely dependent on U.S. support. Even though the native Filipinos generally resented the fact that there were U.S. military bases all over their islands. As a result, Philippines have had a history of violent, corrupt dictators and rebels, including the one to this day, a guy named Duterte, who basically has death squads going around in an attempt to combat the drug problem in the Philippines, although notably, no one ever gets charged for civilian deaths. Basically, he said, if you're even, not basically, literally he said, if you're even around drug dealers, you're helping them, you're a target. Myanmar would not have a and you can see him on the map here, a non-military leader until 2016. Malaysia is a rare case of a multi-ethnic success in a former colony. So Malaysia actually is a pretty successful place. To this day, steady growth and very politically stable. Singapore is one of the richest nations in the world. Singapore is a tiny little island, so it's basically a city-state. It's one of the few city-states left on Earth. And there's a great super cool history that I don't have time in this video to go over, but they're a place that put in a massive emphasis on education and high-skilled labor. As a result, they're one of the richest countries in the world. Indonesia has only had 2 leaders in the last 52 years. Indonesia is this massive territory made up of 13,000 islands and is deeply poverty-stricken. East Timor, which is this little bitty island over here, once part of Indonesia, is actually one of those great examples where they voted to leave on ethnic lines, and then they asked for support to the UN helped them, and they achieved independence. So, I remember when this happened. I was about your guys' age when this happened or so. So this was a big deal, right? These guys voted themselves out of another country. The UN sent peacekeepers in to make sure that nothing overly violent happened. It was a great success story. All right, now to Africa. This is also why if somebody says, oh, an African, there is no such thing, guys. There's like 42, 47, something like that countries here. And even within countries, you have a great deal of variety. I believe, if I recall correctly, in Zimbabwe, there is something like 12 official languages. That's not the languages people speak, that's 12 official languages. By contrast, the United States has 1 official language, English. All right. Oh, by the way, there are 6 pictures here. Try to figure out which one is not an actual picture from Africa. So, we have Ghana, which was the first sub-Saharan colony to gain freedom. Sub-Saharan means it's anything located down here. It won its independence through nonviolent movement. I'm not going to attempt to say his name and be insulting, but the movement leader had good intentions. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to run the country effectively, and within a few years, a military coup took control until 2000. Thank you, buddy. So, Kenya and Algeria fought bloody wars for independence against the British and the French, respectively. Kenya suffered from ethnic conflict, Algeria from religious conflict. To this day, both suffer with widespread poverty. By the way, Kenya is, of course, the birthplace of former President Barack Obama's father. So, his father was actually born during the colonial period. And the widespread poverty is one of the major reasons that he left to the United States, which is why we had our first black president. The Congo and Angola, they are the stereotype of the violent, damaged African nations. The Congo to this day has had a series of warlords. Angola was part of a major proxy war during the Cold War. You can actually participate in a digital version in Black Ops 2, in fact. Rwanda saw one of the worst examples of ethnic genocide post-World War II with 1 million dead in 4 months. Alright, so this one down here, guys, is not an actual picture from Africa. This is a picture of Wakanda from the movie Black Panther. Everything else here is, of course, real. Alright, the Middle East. Oh God, the Middle East. Pun intended. So, the Middle East has a couple states. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quick here, guys. Israel was created post-World War II as deliberately an independent Jewish nation. However, because it includes Jerusalem, the holy cities of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, there's been a long series of wars starting in the late 60s through the 80s with Israel over territory. To this day, the Palestinians, whose land was taken from them to build Israel, resent immensely their control by the Israeli Jews. So there is to this day a major political argument going on over who's right, who's wrong, and who deserves more control. The Arab states, the most important thing, you guys can read the rest on your own, is that the economies are mainly oil-based. Iran is not an Arabic ethnic state. They are Muslim, just like all these other countries, but they are Persians. Okay, meaning that they're actually a different ethnic group, and this goes to why there's so much conflict in the area. Peace remains unlikely. Alright, this last one, I hate to cut it so short, but I'm down to like 15 seconds. Central Asia, a bunch of Soviet states emerged after the Cold War. You can see I've listed these. The main thing, they are among the poorest countries in the world because the Soviets left nothing. Afghanistan, of course, has one of the longest records of conflict. All right, guys, that's it.